Good afternoon, everyone. As he said, my name is Kelia, part of the IDebate team. Before I begin, I would like to thank all of you for showing up. Thank you for attending our event, and thank you for hosting us. It was really a pleasure to have all of you here and to be able to debate with the other team. Now, today's resolution states that foreign aid has done more harm than good. But before I go on to my arguments, I would like to ask a question to the affirmative. Now, the first affirmative speaker came up and talked about corruption and talked about how foreign aid is being misused by some of the countries. Now, my question becomes, what is the problem in that case? Is the problem the foreign aid or the problem the people who receive that foreign aid and use it? Is the problem aid or the leaders that use foreign aid? Now, foreign aid is defined as, from the perspective of governments, a voluntary transfer of resources from one country to another, as they have mentioned. Aid may serve for one or more functions. It may be given as a signal of diplomatic approval or to strengthen a military ally, to reward the government for behavior desired by the donor, to provide infrastructure needed by the donor for resources extraction from the recipient country, or to gain other kinds of commercial access. Countries may provide or at least be partly responsible for giving aid. Now, today's motion asks us to analyze whether foreign aid has done more harm than good. We do not deny that foreign aid has done both, but we, as the negative, advocate that foreign aid has done more good than harm, for two main reasons, which are: the humanitarian aid has saved 1,000 lives, and foreign aid has boosted infrastructure development in African countries. On to my first argument. Humanitarian aid has saved 1,000 lives. Humanitarian aid is a material or logistically assistance provided for humanitarian purposes, typically in response to humanitarian crises, including natural disasters and man-made disasters. The primary objective of humanitarian aid is to save lives, alleviate suffering, and maintain human dignity. It may therefore be distinguished from the development aid, which seeks to address the underlying socio-economic factors, and which may have led to a crisis or emergency. Humanitarian aid has provided food for refugees and those who were vulnerable when a natural calamity happened, as stated by an article written by the International Relations Education. The World Food Programme, which is an aid organization which focuses on fighting hunger, has helped more than 80 million people in 80 countries around the world. Each year, the World Food Programme distributes more than 12.6 billion rations. Nearly 70% of their work is done in conflict-affected countries. Moreover, humanitarian aid has helped a lot in combating diseases like HIV, AIDS, and malaria, especially in African countries. When most of malaria outbreaks occurred in African countries, especially due to wars and political instability, humanitarian organizations like the World Vision have established facilities to fight this disease. Malaria control has been cited as one of the most notable achievements of international aid, with even critical reports highlighting a 32% decrease in death attributable to the disease from 2004 to 2006, just a space of 6 years. Key malaria interventions in several countries have resulted in significant progress. For example, in Zambia, deaths among children under 5 years have decreased by 72%. Zanzibar in Tanzania has seen an 81% drop in malaria deaths, all this because of humanitarian aid. In 2011, Armenia was certified as malaria-free. But not only malaria, we're also going to talk about diseases like HIV/AIDS, whereby aid has helped to employ and train medical workers who spread awareness about the disease. They talk about how the disease is spread and how it can be controlled. Aid has helped to fund a lot of anti-AIDS and HIV campaigns, while HIV was a real human threat in African countries. Humanitarian aid was also very efficient in 2014, when a deadly disease called Ebola broke out in the West African countries. One of the countries that were seriously affected by this disease was Liberia, whereby almost 5,000 people were killed and 200 health workers died in the process. Now, international bodies such as the World Health Organization and the US Army and Centers for Disease Control and Prevention constructed, equipped, and staffed treatment centers for Ebola patients. Most Liberians say that the foreign assistance was more effective than Liberian institutions in providing care for Ebola patients and bringing the epidemic under control. Due to the fact that aid has provided facilities that could have not been provided by the state itself, it therefore makes foreign aid more harm than good. Now, the second point is that aid has helped in infrastructure development. Foreign aid, as stated, has helped in building infrastructure such as roads, buildings, and hospitals. Now, for countries like Rwanda, building roads is too expensive to fit in the national budget. But with the aid of China, which is one of our donors, Rwanda was able to build more roads throughout the country. With the same aid, the government was able to extend good quality roads to neighboring countries. Building connecting roads between neighboring countries facilitated the exchange of cash crops, goods, foods, and all related subjects. Now, the country's economy increases with time, and it now ranks the third fastest growing economy. Trade between countries has greatly contributed to the development of people and their financial status. It has enabled the local farmers to transport their goods from one country to another, thus increasing the country's revenue. On top of that, foreign aid has helped in building most of the well-equipped hospitals in Africa. For a very long period of time, the problem of hospitals has been a real threat to the medical sector. According to the World Health Organization, countries that have cut off foreign aid have experienced an increased rate in infant mortality rate, an increase in the spread of waterborne diseases, as well as malnutritional diseases. While the countries that have kept foreign aid available have experienced an efficiency and an improvement in medical sector, in terms of more hospitals that were built and also more experienced workers. My second speaker will elaborate more on the reasons as to why we believe foreign aid has done more good than harm. Thank you.
So I think in this debate, there is one thing that we all have to agree with. No matter what all African countries or Asian countries are going through, the leaders have to take the first step to make sure that they're able to provide the basic needs to their citizens. Now, I want to answer two of their arguments, and then I will link them up to some of my arguments. The first thing they talked about is humanitarian aid. That is very fine, and we appreciate that some people, some countries really come up when we have issues that are happening in our countries to give support. But now, I want you to think about one thing that is really becoming an issue in this debate. When they talk about infrastructure development, China now has a program of constructing roads that connect all African countries. To me, I do not take that as aid because they love Africa so much that they have a lot to give to Africa. No, I assume that is an investment because when they build those roads are the same roads they come back to sell their products. So what they're doing is that they're making it easy for their industries, they're making it easy for their companies to come and do trade in Africa. So what they do, they construct a road of $20 billion, and then they come use the same road to sell products that are worth $60 billion. Now the question of the debate is aid doing more harm than good? If we are to put on a balance, $60 million profit and $20 million investment, is that good to African countries? Is that good to Asian countries? Or it is good for the countries that are giving aid? It is good for some people like the opposition side that is believing that what aid does is just to blind people, not to see that people actually using those countries that are giving aid to actually exploit them, to even use the little money they have for them to do what? To again buy their products. When they talk of the hospitals that are being built, no one denies that building a hospital is a good thing. It's a great idea. But when you build a hospital and tell people to employ your own doctors, what does that mean? It means that you're building hospitals so that you can create employment to your people and give cheap jobs to people in those countries. Now, the question still comes to the debate. Is that more good or more harm, even if it's a good thing? Now, I want to go back to one of my first arguments, and then I'll link it to the point they mentioned about humanitarian aid. What aid does, it kills the relationship between the government and its people. So this one brings me to my argument of aid restrains the growth of democracy. So for democracy to be there has to be a government that is questioned by the people. There has to be a government that is accounted by the people. There has to be a government that is for the people and by the people, and for the people to question that what is happening in this government. So if aid comes in and provides all the basic needs that they talked about, because if a government fails to provide medicine to its people, is that government really doing good, or it's a failing government? Those are basic needs that should be provided by the government that is in power. Now, if aid is coming in to do all the basic needs, to provide good water, to provide medicine for malaria, to provide medicine for AIDS, to provide each and everything they mentioned about, the people don't now depend on the government because they believe that there's some people outside who are actually doing what the government is doing. So the relationship, the growth in democracy is stopped trapped there because people don't interact with the government. Now, another thing that does is that when the government feels like it's getting money from people for them to do all the things that they need to do for the public, the government is no longer attracted to build a tax base. What does that mean? It means that the government is not attracted to build good roads that they talked about, to build good infrastructure that is going to allow small businesses to grow so that the government can collect taxes and then use taxes for development, because they feel like the money is coming from other people. So what does that mean, people? That means that if the government cannot be able to build tax base, we are going to have a bigger gap between the poor and the rich people. Because what it does is that the rich people who have connection to the government are the people who are still going to make money. As my first speaker said it, that the rich are going to be rich and the poor are going to be poor. So what that does is that we do not have a middle class that is going to question the government, because the poor people are so silenced by the rich people who are getting money directly from the government, directly from the donors. Then the middle class dies in there, and then the government stays in power for long. Then that's when we have dictatorships. That when you have people who are just holding money, you hear a country has a GDP of $1 billion, or a GDP of $1 billion, but when you go, you realize that people are dying down there. People don't have money to satisfy their own people with just small basic needs. Now the question is that aid doing more good or it's doing more harm? Yes, you might blind us with short-term benefits, as my first speaker mentioned it. The aid dependency, that's my second argument, is the biggest question in this debate, because people depend so much on aid that they don't think of what to do in case aid stops. And because there is no guarantee that the person who gives you willingly is going to continue to give you every day. So when the aid stops, what happens to African countries? What happens to countries that you've given debts that they're not going to be able to pay even in the next 10 generations? The question of this debate should be for people to understand that the African problems, the Asian problems, or all these third countries' problems, what they need their leaders to step up and be able to at least provide the basic needs to their people. Now, my third speaker is going to come back and also elaborate more. Who do we blame between the leaders and the aid? Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. I'd like to thank you all for being here. So first, I'm going to go over the Affirmation Case and the arguments they make. In their first speech, they bring up the idea that debt is being used as a tool of war when it comes to aid. But this contradicts something else that the second speaker just brought up. The fact that when countries pull out their aid, these countries collapse because they don't know how to respond without getting money. This is exactly what these stipulations on debt, this paternalistic relationship, does. It builds the country's ability to be able to sustain on its own, so that once that aid is actually removed, they can survive on their own. Furthermore, another contradiction they hold is their second and third arguments being the fact that, one, they state that aid leads to corruption, but then they come back and immediately follow that by saying that when a country demands that the aid is spent in a certain way or another, then that in itself is also harmful. But this is contradictory. You're arguing that the government's leaders don't know how to spend the money, but then you're arguing that the government should be able to spend the money however much they want. This flaw in thinking is why we can see that aid is actually beneficial and that it's okay to have a paternalistic relationship. One of the questions my teammate asked during their first speech was that, is all aid paternalistic? And the affirmation said that they believe that most forms of aid are. This shows that they even say that some forms of aid are okay, but we hold that paternalistic relationships are okay. We don't expect children to know everything that they should, how they should act, what they need to buy. They need their parents' guidance. Even if they don't think so, even if other people don't think so, in the end, the parents or the children are dependent on the parents. Now, when we look at the neg case, my teammate, my first speaker, brought up the fact that it helps in humanitarian aid. I'm going to strengthen this by arguing that it is also helpful in terms of natural disasters. This is an area where not many people think that aid is useful. But when we see and look back on some of the biggest natural disasters we've had in our country, if you look, or in our world, if you look at Japan's reaction to Fukushima and the international aid that went to it and saved it from a disaster following their nuclear reactor, if we look at the Indonesia tsunami, we can see that foreign aid actually helps save these people's lives. Foreign aid is extremely efficient when it comes to helping after natural disaster because there are multiple forms of aid. There are things such as cash grants, which were used in this Indonesia tsunami and also in the Haiyan typhoon in the Philippines. This aid allowed individuals to get their own, to decide what they needed, the opposite of what the affirmation brings up, this paternalistic argument. Yes.
All right, so you sound like every time all these poor countries have disasters. But now the question is, helping a problem that is just there for one day and then a long-term problem that is going to be there for each and every day, which one is good and which one is bad?
So it is without a doubt good to help people who just suffered a disaster, because if we don't help them, then they may not recover. But also, we on the negation still hold that there are long-term benefits of aid, something I'm about to get to you. So you also argue that infrastructure is not actually helpful because this is only for the benefit of the donor nation. But I ask the question, why is something that's mutually beneficial both for the donor nation and the nation receiving aid all of a sudden not aid? Just because China may benefit because it built roads doesn't mean this isn't going to be aid. When it comes down to it, buildings are going to be built upon those roads. Those roads will connect the people to institutions in their society. Just because this also helps China doesn't mean that it's not necessarily aid. Moving forward, they also argue that there is this lack of democracy because of aid, that aid is weakening governments and it's weakening the relationship between the government and the people. But there is a specific form of foreign aid designed to improve democracy, titled democratic aid. This aid is given by countries specifically to areas that democracy needs to thrive, things such as media outlets, in creating two competitive parties, in actually enfranchising the people to make sure they have the opportunity to vote and make their voices heard. This democratic aid is a form of foreign aid, and I think that both sides can agree that by establishing this democracy, by allowing the people to have their voices heard and have better opportunities to get representatives, this is a long-term benefit. This allows them to make decisions in the future and help decide what is going to be best for their country. Yes?
Do you mind giving an example of where aid has actually contributed to bring democracy in a country?
So the United States has been giving this democratic aid to many countries in South Africa. I don't know the name off the top of my head, but they are giving this aid to organizations that do help ensure democracy exists and grows within these countries. Now, furthermore, they also make the argument that the middle class is actually disappearing and there's becoming a bigger gap between the rich and the poor. But if we look at the alternative to this, to leaving those who are impoverished to their own fates, to them not getting any support, I'd say that not having a middle class is actually better than having a lower class consistently suffer due to the fact that they don't have enough to survive, due to the fact that their government cannot ensure these basic benefits that the affirmation brought up. So when looking back at today's debate, we can see that overall, aid is helpful. Yes, the negation is not arguing that aid is flawless and everything is perfect, because in the end, nothing is perfect. But these flaws with aid can even go to help it. We can see where to develop. We can see how aid is being beneficial and how it hurts people and fix those problems. So when we look at it, aid is actually beneficial because it can increase both short-term benefits and in immediately remediating after natural disaster, and it can also serve these long-term benefits in establishing a democracy, in building this infrastructure that countries can then use to wean off of this aid. Finally, we must look at the idea of aid being paternalistic as a bad thing, because this is just not true. Being paternalistic does not make it bad. The affirmation even brings up that the governments will not use this aid correctly in some instances. So this is why we need this paternalistic relationship. We don't expect children to know 100% what to do with their lives. We expect their parents to do something for them. This is what aid is doing. The aid is channeling them in the correct direction and making sure that they will be able to be independent in the future. This is why the negation holds that aid is in the end better.
Okay. Hi, y'all. I'm Nina. And so just to give you an overview as to how this is going to go down, I'm going to expand on our arguments while responding to the arguments that they made on behalf of those arguments. So like just giving you a reminder of what we've said, and then I'm going to respond to some of the arguments they said. So to start this off, our opponent brought up this question of, if the problem with foreign aid is that it's the people, not the foreign aid, why do we have an issue? Well, if you can see that the problem is the people, why would we continue giving them billions of dollars? That is the issue. It is not so much, oh, foreign aid isn't the direct cause, but if foreign aid is allowing these gaps to continue, then why would we continue giving them billions and billions of dollars to only help these leaders? Now, we start off with our argument of debt as a tool of structural violence. They say that this contradicts this because of our paternalistic argument. No, the stipulations put there are harmed, like we gave specific examples as to how the stipulations harmed these countries. They say broadly, like, oh, these stipulations help, without giving any examples of how it does. We said Zimbabwe, we said Nepal, we said South Africa. We give you examples as to how this really does work as structural violence. They say corruption, and that we say that we are like saying, oh, don't tell them what to do, but look what happens when they don't do that. No, we're saying these leaders are bad. Stop giving them foreign aid because you're helping them put bad policies out. That is what we're saying. And that foreign aid is not effective as it is currently. For the paternalistic argument, they argue paternalism is good, referring to these countries as children and the United States as their parents, as if these countries don't have their own ideas and values and histories, as if the reason that they're developing is because countries like the United States, like the UK, like most of Western civilization hasn't gone there and pillaged them and colonized them and caused all these problems, and then we turn around and say, oh, here's aid, we're so generous. No, that is paternalistic in the worst way. That is painting us in this wonderful light after we're the reason most of their problems exist to this day. They do not get to turn around and say paternalism good. Next argument. They say that this, again, enforces democracy, but they don't address my partner's argument saying that it kills the relationship between the government and the people. The government doesn't need to listen to the people if they're getting their money from foreign entities. They don't need to say, let me appeal to my people. I'm getting taxes from there, therefore let me reciprocate by giving you what you need. No, that means that they will only listen to things that benefit them, and that kills democracy. They say democracy is created, but it's democracy created by those foreign entities, not the democracy that the people want. And if democracy is from the people, it must come from the people of those countries, not other people. And then they bring a middle class, and they say a middle class isn't good. We had a lot of very strong evidence as to why a middle class is good. And furthermore, we said that foreign aid it's not that the foreign aid doesn't just not create a middle class, it makes the wage gap, the wage gap even worse. It makes the poorer even poorer. So it's not solely a matter of them being poor, it's that foreign aid puts them in even more poverty. Now, to respond to their argument, while, again, as all of my partners have said before, there is good aid. We're not saying that all aid is bad. Humanitarian aid is a good thing, and we do acknowledge that. However, humanitarian is one very specific type of foreign aid. When there is aid that is aid of financial aid, war aid, government aid, non-governmental aid, you cannot say that foreign aid causes more goods than harms when only one fraction of it is the type of aid that they're advocating for. All these other aids create the problems that me and my partners have said before, and therefore why you should believe, because it's true, that foreign aid causes more harm than good. So they bring up this China example, and they say, why can't a country go into another country and just build roads, and maybe it will benefit everyone? But the last time a country came into Africa and started changing its structure was when the African countries were made and native kingdoms were destroyed. They purposely built it so that Africa would be less powerful. That was actively done by colonial powers. So why should Africa have to just trust in these countries when history and time again has proved that that countries coming into Africa has not been successful? It is up to those countries to prove to Africa that they're worth it, and as of so far, they have not. Figuring out with the development, they said that it could bring jobs, but as my partners said, the careers made are they bring professionals from their countries to take the jobs that they create. They bring professionals from their country to take jobs that could be given to African countries. They take over African countries economically, structurally, and governmentally, and that is not okay. Foreign aid may have some humanitarian pluses, but it does not outweigh the overarching themes and real life impacts that it presents. So that's why you should vote for the House. Thank you.
Foreign aid is really directed mainly toward natural disasters and humanitarian aid. And like the fight on HIV and AIDS in Africa, on the continent of Africa, has worked out. And there's so many people who have been benefited from that and been educated on how to prevent those diseases from coming. And also, building a country is hard, and they need ways to go about it. We understand all of the implications and the concurrent harms that colonialism has brought upon many developing countries, but it's nearly we're already in the 21st century, and it's very, very impossible to fix these issues. So we focus on foreign aid as a way to at least help develop these countries and help them in their development process. Because we've seen in the past with African and other developing countries forms of socialist movements and other grassroots organizations movement to try and overthrow the government. And in those times, it has not worked out. So we give out these aids, well, developed nations specifically give out this aid to assist those countries. So here's just some examples. And in regards to the Zimbabwe example, one person in particular who's actually in charge of World Vision's food assistance programs is from Zimbabwe and was a part of the population who was actually starving to death and was thankfully fed by this organization. So that's Thabani Mabosa, who is now in charge of the World Vision's food assistance programs, who helps and wants to fight the starvation that's going on in many African countries. And also, in regards to, what was it? Okay, and also U.S. foreign aid covers funding for everything from programs such as like Cavoso, where girls are actually learning to code for to fight sexual harassment, and delivering 1.9 billion medications that saved 7,403 people from tropical diseases like trachoma, which is a devastating disease which left untreated will cause people to be blind. And also the U.S. is the largest food aid provider to Syria, and the U.S. helps feed 5 million hungry people each month in Syria as conflict and civil war in the country has shut off food supplies for some 6.5 million people internationally displaced in the country. And just to reiterate what my partners have said, is the problem actually with the aid itself or the people using the aid? And unfortunately, there is this hierarchical system in these developing nations where the rich stay richer and they keep the aid to themselves and the poor get poor, which is unfortunate, which is why my partner also brought up democracy aid to help democracy thrive in these countries. And there's an example of, yes?
So what's to stop these countries from listening to the people providing them aid over the people who are poor and can't provide them any money?
Can you explain that again?
So
Sorry.
you said democracy, it helps provide democracy. But what's to stop these governments, as they commonly do, to listen to the countries and organizations providing them aid over their people who can't provide them any money? We gave multiple examples of that. How do you respond to that?
Well, for democratic aid in particular, developed nations like the United States, Britain, and China even have implemented policies and directly funded aid to organizations who are, have led to coup d'etats and to overthrow the government, and other programs to put more stable and more democratic leaders in charge of certain countries, as one of my examples was what happened in Ukraine, to be able to stop this gap and develop a middle class. And we also, in regards to what you said about the middle class being bad, we don't think the middle class is being bad. It's just not possible with this certain hierarchical structure. And this is, well, I'm out of time, but this is why I think you should vote for the next side. And thank you all for coming to the debate, making time for it, and listening to me speak. Thank you.